The plain stretched endless beneath the early sun, a sea of gold rippling in the gentle wind. Dust rose like whispers from the earth, curling and twisting, catching the light, turning each particle into a fragment of memory. On the horizon, jagged mesas stood like ancient sentinels, silent and patient, their shadows stretching long over the land. Somewhere, a lone cabin rested, wooden and worn, its timbers breathing quietly with the rhythm of the day. Smoke drifted lazily from the chimney, a soft gray ribbon curling into the pale blue sky. Inside the cabin, the air smelled faintly of pine, earth, and the faint tang of iron from the tools that lay neatly on a workbench. Sunlight fell through a small window, casting warm streaks across the wooden floor. Each ray seemed to hold a story, a secret history of hands that built this home, of nights spent listening to the wind and the soft hoot of an owl. The settler moved quietly through the room, careful not to disturb the stillness. His hands were rough, scarred by labor and by the solitude that marked his life on the frontier, yet there was a gentle precision to the way he worked. He paused at the window, eyes narrowing slightly as he watched movement along the creek that cut through the nearby brush. A figure crouched by the water, her hands tracing ripples, her reflection broken into shards by the currents. She was young, but there was a resilience in her posture, a quiet dignity that belonged to one who had known hardship but refused to be diminished by it. Her hair, dark and glistening with sunlight, tumbled over her shoulders in gentle waves. Her eyes, wide and observant, followed each movement of the water, as though trying to catch the secrets of the world hidden beneath its surface. He had seen her from afar before, often glimpsing her shadowed figure along the edges of the village. The world had taught her caution. Every glance carried the weight of unspoken histories, of people who underestimated her because of her youth or her heritage. Yet there was a fire in her gaze, a curiosity that refused to be quenched, and it drew him quietly as the moon draws the tide. In his pocket, he carried a small object wrapped carefully in a cloth. A mirror, simple and unadorned, its surface polished to a soft glow. He had found it among the things left by travelers long gone, an object overlooked by many, but treasured by him for its ability to capture truth without judgment. Today, he had decided, she would see herself as he saw her, strong, courageous, and unbroken. He approached the creek slowly, each step measured, mindful not to startle her. When she noticed him, her eyes widened, but she did not retreat. Instead, she regarded him with a mixture of curiosity and caution, as though weighing his intentions in the quiet of her heart. He knelt on the ground, careful to keep his movements deliberate and unthreatening. "I have something for you," he said softly, offering the small wrapped object. Her hands trembled slightly as she accepted it, unwrapping the cloth with deliberate care. The mirror gleamed in the sunlight, reflecting the sky above and the face that stared back at her. She gasped softly, a sound caught between disbelief and awe. She had seen herself in streams and shadows, but never quite like this. The reflection staring back was hers, yet somehow more vivid, more alive than any image she had known. He watched quietly as she traced the edges with her fingers, marveling at the way light danced across the surface. There was a moment of stillness, profound in its simplicity, a moment where nothing else existed but the quiet connection between two souls. No words were necessary. The mirror had spoken for him. It had shown her worth, not as a gift, but as a recognition of what was already there. The wind carried the faint rustle of leaves, the distant cry of a hawk circling above, yet inside that small space, the world felt suspended. She finally looked up at him, eyes bright with unshed tears, a smile breaking gently across her face. He nodded once, silent affirmation that she was seen, truly seen, and it was enough. Nearby, the village stirred with the soft rhythms of daily life. Children laughed in the distance, their voices like the delicate chime of bells. An elder watched from the shadows of a tree, observing without interfering, a quiet guardian of the moment. The settler and the girl shared a space that felt sacred, insulated from judgment and expectation, a small island of understanding in a world often too harsh to notice such beauty. He rose, brushing dust from his knees, and they walked slowly back toward the cabin. The girl held the mirror close, as if protecting a fragile treasure, yet she kept glances up at him, unspoken gratitude shining in her gaze. There was no rush, no expectation, just the soft, steady rhythm of two people walking through a world that had not yet fully revealed its dangers. As the sun dipped lower, painting the sky in hues of amber and rose, shadows stretched across the cabin and the plains beyond. He worked quietly by the fire, repairing tools, stacking wood, preparing for the long night ahead. She watched him, curious, learning the quiet routines that defined his solitary life. Words were few, but understanding grew in the spaces between silence and action. Night came slowly, draping the world in soft folds of darkness. Stars emerged, scattered like fragments of silver across the vast canvas above. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it the scent of earth, smoke, and distant wildflowers. In the cabin, the mirror rested on the wooden table, reflecting the flickering firelight, and in its glow, the girl's eyes held the spark of a new beginning. There was a sense, unspoken yet palpable, that the world beyond the cabin was vast and unpredictable. Rumors of conflict lingered in the whispers of the wind, distant drums that hinted at dangers, yet unseen. But for now, in this quiet sanctuary, there was a fragile peace, a momentary pause in a story still unfolding. He watched her as she finally leaned back, closing her eyes for a brief moment, taking in the sensation of being fully seen. The world outside might be harsh, filled with judgment and suspicion, yet here, in the light of the fire and the reflection of the mirror, she was whole. And in that wholeness, he found something he had not anticipated, a stirring of the heart, quiet, careful, but undeniable. The night deepened, stars wheeling overhead, and the cabin seemed to breathe with them. Outside, the wind whispered secrets of what was to come, of trials that would test courage, patience, and kindness. But inside, a bond had begun, fragile as a leaf, yet rooted in a shared recognition of humanity and grace. In the silence, he whispered to himself, almost a prayer, almost a promise. You are seen. You are known. You are not alone. And for the first time in many quiet nights, the world outside seemed a little less vast, a little less lonely, as two hearts, unspoken but profoundly connected, waited for the dawn together. The morning came softly, draped in a gentle haze of pale gold and mist that clung to the low hills like memory itself. The wind moved lazily across the plains, bending the tall grasses in ripples that whispered secrets only the land could understand. Birds traced arcs in the sky, their calls scattered and brief, each note echoing against the mesas. In the distance, the creek glimmered, a silver ribbon threading through the earth, carrying sunlight and shadow alike. She arrived first, as if drawn by some unspoken rhythm, carrying the small mirror wrapped carefully in cloth. He watched her from the cabin door, leaning against the frame, a mug of coffee warming his hands. There was a quiet dignity in her movements, the kind that did not demand attention but invited notice. Her eyes lingered on him briefly, a shadow of a smile touching her lips, and then she knelt by the water. Together they worked in silence, tending to small tasks that held worlds in their simplicity. He repaired the wooden fence along the creek, smoothing the rough edges, his hands skilled and deliberate. She gathered wildflowers and herbs, arranging them loosely along the cabin window, letting the colors bleed into the warm sunlight. Words were few, unnecessary. The rhythm of their cooperation, the shared care of the land and the cabin, spoke louder than any conversation could. Occasionally, she lifted the mirror to the light, studying the reflection of her own face. There was a quiet transformation in those moments, subtle but profound. She traced the curve of her jaw, the angle of her cheek, the soft sweep of her hair across her forehead, And in the reflection, she began to recognize not the girl she had been, cautious and hidden, but the woman she was becoming, strong, present, unafraid of her own worth. He noticed the change, not with words, but in the way he looked at her. There was a respect in his gaze, an acknowledgement of her courage and intelligence, of the depth of her thoughts and the steadiness of her heart. It was a quiet kind of admiration, the kind that blooms slowly, like wildflowers in hidden crevices, unnoticed until the season has fully come. The village beyond the creek hummed softly with life. Children played among the trees, their laughter like wind chimes caught in sunlight. An elder watched from the shade, leaning on a crooked cane, eyes filled with the wisdom of many years. Even the animals seemed to pause, sensing the rhythm of their quiet world, the pulse of life that moved gently but insistently. Yet the wind carried other sounds too. Distant voices, uncertain and hushed. Drums, faint but persistent, beating somewhere beyond the hills. Whispers of movement among the trees, a shadow passing too quickly across the edge of vision. It was as though the world beyond their little sanctuary was alive with stories yet to be told, some beautiful, some dangerous. He spoke rarely, letting the small moments unfold. When he did, it was with care, each word chosen like a stone placed carefully in a river to guide its flow. She listened, leaning in, absorbing his stories of the land, of animals he had known, of nights spent under endless skies, and of the strange travelers who left pieces of themselves behind in the form of small treasures, like the mirror, now hers to hold. She responded in kind, not always with words, but with glances, with soft laughter, with questions that revealed her curiosity and sharp mind. She told him of the hidden paths through the hills, of herbs that healed more than the body, of the quiet language of the wind and the water. And he, in turn, listened with an openness rare in the world he had known, learning to see through her eyes, to notice what he had always overlooked. Their bond grew not in the grand gestures of romance, but in the simplicity of shared life. In the way she offered him water from the creek, and he shared a story of a star that guided lost travelers. In the quiet moments by the fire, when the wind rattled the cabin walls and the night pressed close, their hands brushed fleetingly, and yet the touch lingered in memory. There were moments of vulnerability, too. She spoke softly of the village, of its expectations, of the weight of being seen as someone to be guided rather than someone who guided herself. He shared fragments of his own solitude, the loneliness that had wrapped around him like a shadow, and the fear of opening to a world that could be as unforgiving as it was beautiful. It was in these shared silences, the spaces between words, that their connection deepened. The mirror, now resting on the cabin table, became a symbol not only of reflection, but of understanding, a reminder that the world was larger than any one perspective, and that recognition, respect, and kindness were the rarest treasures of all. But as the days unfolded, hints of tension threaded through their world. Travelers spoke in hushed tones of unrest beyond the hills, of tribes moving, of settlers uneasy in their own claims. Rumors of conflict reached the edges of the village, carried by wind, by words, by the eyes of those who watched. The drums, distant but insistent, marked a rhythm that no one could ignore, a pulse that promised change, perhaps danger, perhaps something neither had yet the words to name. Yet within the cabin, the rhythm of life continued. She learned the subtle art of his work, how to smooth a plank, how to measure the land with careful hands, how to anticipate the weight of a hammer. He noticed her attentiveness, the grace with which she moved, the thoughtfulness in her actions, and a quiet pride swelled in him. Not pride of ownership, but of witnessing strength that was self-born, of seeing courage bloom in someone who had been underestimated by the world. Evenings came with a softness that seemed impossible in the harshness of the plains. The sky turned a deep indigo, dotted with stars that reflected in the mirror she held, a double sky, one outside and one within. They sat together on the porch, side by side, sharing silence, listening to the wind, to the distant calls of night birds, to the faint whisper of the creek. Their conversation was minimal, but every glance, every pause, carried more weight than 100 spoken words. It was in these quiet nights that the first threads of trust and affection were woven. Neither rushed the other, nor demanded anything that could not be freely given. Their bond was a careful tending of fire, lit slowly, maintained with patience, fed by gestures of respect, and warmed by shared understanding. She began to speak of her dreams, not with the exaggeration of youth, but with the subtle poetry of one who has known hardship and yet believes in possibility. He listened, noting the light in her eyes when she spoke of the land, of the animals, of the horizon that promised more than the world had yet shown. And in that listening, he discovered his own quiet hopes, the parts of himself he had kept hidden, emerging now in response to her courage and curiosity. But the drums in the distance persisted, insistent, unrelenting. Shadows of doubt crept into the edges of their peace. Travelers' whispers spoke of misunderstandings, of fear, of conflict waiting just beyond sight. And though the world seemed vast and unknowable within the cabin, in the reflected light of the mirror and the warmth of shared presence, they found a space of safety, of understanding, of something fragile and beautiful that deserved protection. The day faded into a gentle dusk, the sky painted in muted shades of rose, amber, and violet. She held the mirror closer now, not merely as an object, but as a talisman, a symbol of the strength she was learning to claim. He worked silently at the fire, stacking wood, preparing for the chill of night and the unspoken tension that lingered just beyond the door. In the quiet, they shared a moment that needed no words. She looked up, eyes meeting his, and in that glance was the acknowledgement of something deeper, something unspoken yet undeniable. There was safety here, yes, but also the stirrings of a heart beginning to trust, to recognize its own capacity for connection and courage. Night fell fully, draping the plains in deep, velvety darkness. The cabin glowed softly, a sanctuary of warmth and quiet light. Outside, the world held its breath, shadows shifting among the trees, distant drums pulsing faintly, a reminder of the larger currents that could not be ignored. But inside, two lives continued their delicate dance, careful, patient, deliberate, weaving trust and intimacy into a tapestry more resilient than either could yet understand. And as she rested the mirror against her lap, staring into the reflection of the flickering firelight, a thought rose unbidden. She was not the same as she had been when the mirror first touched her hands. The reflection was hers, yes, but also the reflection of courage, of quiet bravery, of a heart learning to open. He watched her, and in that watching he saw the world anew. The small moments, the tender gestures, the gentle laughter, all became luminous, like fireflies caught in the twilight, a delicate brilliance that made the hardships of the plains bearable, meaningful, and in a small, sacred way, beautiful. Outside, the wind carried the faint drumbeat again, closer this time, a warning or a promise, the line between danger and destiny blurred. And yet, inside, they remained undisturbed, cocooned in a quiet intimacy that would fortify them for the trials to come, moments of shared courage that would shape the heart of the story yet to unfold. The horizon was restless that morning. A pale haze clung to the mesas, and the wind carried whispers that seemed heavier than before, the distant rhythm of drums pressing faintly against the edges of thought. The plains, so long a canvas of quiet gold, felt charged, as if the earth itself was aware of change. Shadows moved differently, slower, yet with purpose. Somewhere far off, a hawk cried, and the sound lingered, stretching thin across the sky like a warning. She came to the creek first, as was her habit, carrying the mirror wrapped carefully in cloth. The reflection it held was no longer just her own face, but the quiet strength she was learning to claim. When he emerged from the cabin, he noted how she moved, no longer timid, no longer merely observing the world, but stepping lightly into it with eyes bright, aware, and unflinching. They worked side by side, repairing a small section of fence that had given way in a recent windstorm. The rhythm of hammer against wood, the careful adjustment of boards, became almost meditative. Words were sparse, replaced by gestures and glances, and yet each movement spoke volumes. In the way she handed him the tools, in the careful way he guided her hands, a subtle intimacy grew, one built on trust, respect, and shared purpose. But beneath the quiet, tension began to seep. Travelers arrived at the village, their faces lined with concern, voices low as they whispered of distant camps gathering, of warriors moving in numbers that unsettled the plains. Rumors spread like fire in dry grass. Misunderstandings, disputes over land, old grievances rekindled. The drumbeats, once faint, now lingered in memory, a rhythm that seemed closer each day, a reminder that the world outside their cabin was vast and unpredictable. The first inkling of danger reached them in the form of a messenger, a boy from the village who had run to the cabin, breathless, with urgent words spilling from his lips. "The settlers are uneasy," he said, eyes wide. "Tribes are gathering beyond the ridge. 300 strong, they say. There is fear." She looked at him, not with panic, but with a calm born of understanding. There was acknowledgment in her eyes, recognition of the weight of the world they had long lived alongside. Yet her resolve did not falter. He felt a shift in himself as he watched her, a quiet admiration deepening into something more profound. The courage in her stance, the clarity in her eyes, mirrored back to him the parts of his own heart he had long kept hidden. They prepared as best they could, not with fear, but with intention. The cabin became a place of quiet readiness, a space where each item, each tool, each gesture held significance. He reinforced the door with careful measurements, securing it against a threat that was as real as it was unknown. She moved with grace, not in panic, but with precision, arranging provisions, tending the small fire, making sure their sanctuary could withstand the coming trial. Yet there was a subtle elegance in their preparation. There was no rush, no clamor of desperation, only the steady, deliberate motion of two people aligned in purpose. She caught him looking at her, and in that glance, unspoken acknowledgment passed between them. They would face whatever came, not as hero and helpless, not as protector and protected, but as equals, bound by respect and quiet bravery. Evenings became moments of reflection and subtle teaching. By the fire, he spoke softly of strategy and caution, of understanding intentions beyond appearances, of seeing the heart beneath the surface of action. She absorbed each word with patience, her gaze steady, her mind sharp. Occasionally, she would interject with insight that surprised him, observations drawn from intuition, from years of listening to the land and its rhythms. He began to see her not as someone he protected, but as someone whose courage and wisdom could guide them both. The drums grew louder, or perhaps he only noticed them more keenly now, their distant beat threading through each moment like a tense refrain. Shadows of movement stretched across the cabin walls, branches tapping in warning, wind whispering of footsteps beyond sight. And yet, in the midst of this mounting tension, their bond deepened. In the shared silences, in the glances that spoke more than words, in the unspoken agreement that they would face what came together, they found a fragile peace. She spoke of the fear she had once carried, of nights when the forest seemed full of unseen eyes, of the weight of history pressing down on her people. He listened, not with pity, but with understanding, acknowledging the depth of her experience, the resilience it had forged. And in return, he shared his own past, the solitude that had wrapped around him like a shadow, the quiet longing for connection that had remained unfulfilled until now. In the quiet glow of firelight, they recognized each other's bravery. She learned that strength did not always roar. It could whisper in moments of stillness. He learned that courage was not always loud. It could bloom in subtle, unassuming ways. And together, they discovered that trust could flourish even in the shadow of uncertainty, that empathy could bridge worlds that many insisted must remain divided. The first signs of the approaching warriors came in the shape of dust clouds on the horizon, rising in slow, deliberate plumes. Horses moved in distant lines, glinting spears catching the last light of day. The drumbeat they had heard in whispers was now unmistakable, steady and unyielding, a heartbeat that pulsed through the plains, through the cabin, through their own rising awareness of what must come. He felt the weight of responsibility, not as a man imposing control, but as one who must balance courage with respect. She stepped forward beside him, not behind, not shielded, but present, poised, steady. They were equals in this moment, partners in facing the uncertainty that had drawn near. And in the quiet between the beats of distant drums, a deeper understanding passed between them. The courage to act with kindness, the bravery to meet fear without hatred, and the wisdom to honor the hearts of those who approached, even in potential conflict. Night fell fully, and with it came the sharp clarity of danger and the soft intimacy of shared vigilance. The cabin, small and humble, became a crucible of resilience, a space where courage was nurtured and trust solidified. Each movement, adjusting a plank, tending a fire, whispering a reminder, was part of an intricate dance, a preparation not only for what might come, but for what they could endure together. In these final hours before confrontation, the bond between them felt unbreakable, forged not by ease, but by the shared understanding of what mattered most: respect, courage, and recognition of each other's humanity. The mirror, resting now by the firelight, reflected not just her face, but their intertwined courage, their shared determination, and the quiet triumph of hearts aligned in purpose. The wind carried the drum beats closer now, a persistent murmur at the edge of hearing, wrapping the night in a tension that was almost tangible. Yet, despite the looming threat, a profound calm had settled between them, a serenity born of knowing they were not alone, that together they could face what approached with dignity, wisdom, and compassion. She touched the mirror gently, a gesture of quiet acknowledgement, as if to remind herself that the strength she saw reflected was not borrowed, not given, but always hers to claim. He watched, and in that moment, he understood that the trials to come were less about danger and more about choice. To meet fear with understanding, to act with honor, to see beyond the surface of what the world might show them. And so, under a sky heavy with stars, under the steady gaze of distant mesas, they waited together. The plains held their breath, the wind paused, and even the drums seemed to hesitate for a moment, as if acknowledging the courage blooming quietly in the small wooden cabin. Two lives, intertwined not by circumstance alone, but by respect, by shared bravery, and by the gentle bloom of understanding, prepared to meet the unknown. The night deepened, carrying with it the faint rustle of leaves, the distant calls of creatures unseen, and the unrelenting rhythm of drums that could no longer be ignored. And yet, inside, the fire glowed warmly, the mirror reflected courage, and two hearts, steady, patient, and unyielding, stood ready. Not with weapons raised, not with fear-driven haste, but with a quiet, profound bravery that no threat could diminish, a courage that would shape the story to come. The first light of dawn crept slowly across the mesas, turning the horizon to gold and amber. The plains, once soft and familiar, now seemed charged with anticipation, every blade of grass trembling in the chill wind. The cabin stood quiet and resolute, its timbers weathered but steadfast, sheltering the two figures within. Dust swirled at the edges of the clearing, carrying distant sounds of movement, the soft rhythm of hooves, the occasional cry of a scout, until finally the mass appeared, 300 warriors, mounted and resolute, arrayed across the plains like a tide of shadow and purpose. The drum beats had grown deafening now, a pulse that seemed to sync with the beating of hearts inside the cabin. Yet the settler did not raise a weapon in haste. He leaned against the doorframe, calm, watching, breathing steadily, each motion deliberate and measured. Beside him, The young woman held the mirror loosely in her hands, reflecting the morning sun in a scattering of fractured light. Her eyes were steady, unafraid, carrying a resolve that belied her years. They did not panic. There was no frantic scrambling, no fear-driven rush to fortify the cabin further. Instead, they moved in quiet tandem, their actions precise, purposeful, each gesture a testament to trust and understanding. She stepped forward unshielded, and for a moment the world seemed to pause. The dust swirling, the wind stilled, the horses snorting softly, as if the plains themselves were holding their breath. The leader of the approaching warriors halted at the edge of the clearing, a figure cloaked in the authority of his people, eyes sharp and discerning. For a long moment, there was only the drum beats, the soft whistling of the wind, and the unspoken dialogue of two worlds meeting across an expanse of history and expectation. She raised the mirror slightly, tilting it so that the sun caught its surface. The light scattered across the field in 1,000 tiny sparks, reflecting not just her face but the cabin, the earth, the sky, the horizon, the quiet humanity of two souls unarmed but unyielding. The warriors hesitated, the leader tilting his head, watching the gleam, the symbolism, the gesture that spoke louder than any words. He stepped forward beside her, voice low but clear, carrying the calm assurance of one who knew both the weight of his actions and the power of restraint. "We mean no harm," he said. "Not to you, not to your people. There is understanding here, and we seek only to honor it." The leader's eyes narrowed, reading, weighing, assessing the truth behind the words. Around him, the warriors shifted, restless but attentive, sensing the sincerity radiating from the cabin, from the girl, from the man who spoke with quiet authority. The tension stretched taut, every heartbeat echoing, every breath a fragile bridge between fear and understanding. Then she spoke, her voice steady and melodic, carrying across the clearing. "Look at this mirror," she said. "See what it reflects. Not just a face, but recognition. Not just a hand, but a gesture of peace. What we hold here is trust, and trust, once offered, can build bridges stronger than any wall." For a long moment, the world held its breath. The wind rustled through the grasses. The horses shifted, snorting softly. Then, slowly, the leader lowered his hand from the spear at his side. Eyes that had burned with suspicion softened, not in weakness, but in understanding. He stepped closer, and with a subtle nod, signaled the warriors to relax, their lines slackening like ropes released. The settler exhaled slowly, relief threading through him, yet he did not smile. Not yet. There was still the weight of history, the shadow of fear that lingered. But beside him, the young woman lifted the mirror again, this time catching the reflected sunlight on her face, and for a moment, it seemed as though the plains themselves were bathed in hope. They spoke together then, not as conqueror and conquered, not as settler and outsider, but as human beings recognizing the heart in another. Words were few, deliberate, weighted with respect and honesty. The leader listened, and the rest of the warriors followed his lead, their eyes shifting from suspicion to curiosity, from wariness to cautious understanding. A few moments passed in silence, the kind that hums with unspoken resolution. Then, gradually, the tension melted like frost under morning sun. Horses shuffled, warriors spoke softly among themselves, and the realization settled like dawn light across the plains. The threat had not been aggression, but a test, a moment for courage, understanding, and respect to meet and be acknowledged. The girl stepped forward once more, mirror in hand, and held it toward the leader. "It is yours," she said, not as a gift of submission, but as a symbol of mutual recognition. In this reflection, see the world not divided, but shared. The leader's hand rose slowly, fingers brushing the surface, and for the first time, he saw not only her face, not only the cabin, but the humanity behind the gesture. A cheer, soft at first and then swelling, arose among the warriors. Not of victory, but of acknowledgement, of shared understanding, of the quiet triumph of courage and empathy over fear. The settler watched, the weight of relief settling into his shoulders, and he realized that bravery was not in the strike of a weapon, but in the strength to extend respect, to meet uncertainty with steadiness, to see the heart where others saw only difference. The morning stretched, lights spilling over the plains, and the cabin no longer felt isolated. It had become a bridge, a symbol of what could exist when fear bowed to understanding. She lowered the mirror, turning to him, and in her eyes he saw both triumph and gratitude, a reflection of the bond that had grown, not through circumstance alone, but through trust, courage, and unspoken devotion. He placed a hand gently on hers, an acknowledgement of shared victory, and together they watched the warriors disperse, returning to their paths beyond the ridges, the drumbeats fading like a heartbeat settling after exertion. The wind carried stories across the plains, stories of bravery, of empathy, of two hearts who had chosen understanding over conflict. The elder from the village appeared then, stepping quietly into the clearing, nodding in respect. "You have done well," he said, "not only in facing fear, but in showing what the heart can do when it is guided by respect and courage." The girl smiled softly, and he watched her, knowing that the mirror she carried now reflected not just her own face, but the quiet triumph of humanity. The plains seemed to breathe around them, dust settling, sunlight scattering across the grasses, the horizon stretching endlessly in golden promise. Together, they returned to the cabin, each step measured, calm, deliberate, carrying the weight of the night's lessons and the lightness of victory born from compassion. The mirror rested finally on the table, catching the morning sun, reflecting not just a face, but the triumph of courage, patience, and understanding. In the days that followed, the cabin became a place of stories, of laughter, of small moments that held the weight of the world. Travelers would stop, drawn by the tale of two souls who had met the storm with steadiness and heart. And in every glance toward the plains, in every ripple across the creek, the memory of courage and quiet diplomacy lingered, a reminder that even in a harsh and unforgiving world, humanity could bloom, tender and strong. And so they lived, not untouched by fear, not untested by circumstance, but strengthened by it. The girl had learned that reflection could reveal courage, the settler that the heart could guide action more powerfully than any weapon. Together, they embodied a truth older than the mesas and as enduring as the plains, that kindness, respect, and empathy could bridge worlds, build trust, and shine through even the darkest moments. And as the sun set each day, casting long shadows across the cabin and the plains beyond, they would look to the horizon, mirror in hand, and remember the lesson of the drums. That true bravery is not in the raising of a hand against another, but in the quiet act of being seen, of seeing, and of choosing understanding over fear. And so, dear traveler, we leave them here, hearts steady, spirits unbroken, knowing that courage can be quiet, that love can grow slowly, and that empathy can bridge even the widest divide. Take a moment, wherever you are watching from, and think of the small gestures of kindness in your life, the moments that ripple farther than you can see. If this story touched your heart, let it echo in your world. Like, comment, and subscribe, and share where you are watching from, because the plains are vast, but the connections we make can stretch farther still. And remember, even a simple act, a small gift, a recognition of another's worth, can change the course of a story, and perhaps even the world.